I'm really excited about sharing this piece. It is the first one from my home art residency, which has the remix theme. And it's taken me a little time to edit it because this piece took me several days to create. And I'm going to show you all of those steps in just a moment. Normally, I'm showing you work in my sketchbook, and that is completed as a warm-up in about 20 minutes to an hour, whether I'm painting or using oil pastels. This particular piece involves fabric, embroidery, and paint, with a little bit of beadwork for embellishment. And I did not stitch it all in one piece. Let me show you how I made this. I created a reference photo for the drawing in a photo editing app using PNG cutouts of myself in different poses and arms from different people so that I had an idea of what the image wanted to be. I then blocked it out on white fabric. I drew loosely the whole time. You'll notice I'm holding the end of the pencil. And then I came back and added in more detail to the drawing before I started painting and embroidering on it. I also made a reference image for the butterfly emerging from the crystal. The crystal is supposed to be like a chrysalis for it. And I used a ruler to make sure that this would be the right size to fit inside the hand that I had drawn to hold it. I am using a foot for my sewing machine that is designed for free motion sewing. I've watched like 4 videos on YouTube on how to do this. It's my first time. I know I'm going to make a lot of mistakes. It says I can go without the foot, but then I risk probably puncturing my finger with a needle, and I don't want to do that. I decided to use a felt backing to add some weight to the fabric and make it easier to stitch on, and I also decided to stitch a couple of practice butterflies before I stitch on the main project. And as stated in the tutorial, she did say when I started off doing this, I was going to have a lot of broken needles. Here's my first broken needle of the project. Well, the first one is done. I'm happy with it considering it's my first ever free motion sewing drawing. There are parts of the body that I don't like the proportion of where I place the wings. I'm going to practice a little bit more. I broke a few needles. I broke a lot of thread, but overall I am happy with my first results. In the initial video I saw, they cut the item or applique down to the size that they wanted before they stitched. I found this super difficult to do with the Mylar, and I found it easier to sew the larger piece on and then cut this away. I can use the scraps for something else, but I can trim it down and then stitch in the details, and that was a lot easier than trying to cut it down to size. So the second butterfly is done. It's not perfectly symmetrical. Parts are a little wonky. It is better than the first. I'm debating about doing more. I'm kind of on a tight deadline right now. I am trying to submit for a call. So what I'm going to do is call this good enough for the moment. I can come back and make a few more if I need to, but there's other parts of the pieces that I want to complete. So we'll move on to that. I'm just sharing a small snippet of the embroidery process for the main figure. I spent the entire day working on this, probably sat at the sewing machine for at least 6 to 8 hours straight. It was a little hard on my back, but it is faster than hand embroidery, and this allowed me to speed up my process quite a bit. I am on a deadline as I'm making this, and being able to do this, drawing on fabric like this with the machine, is definitely a technique that I will be adding to future projects that I will be doing. I just might stretch it out over the course of several days instead of trying to stitch everything all in one day. And I definitely need to add some better yoga stretches to my exercises to help with that sewing machine back pain. Here is what it looked like after I finished machine stitching the entire piece. I also cut apart some of my custom fabric to create the flower petals, and I did some loose outlining of those flower petals as I began the collage process. The day after I completed the stitching, I came back in and added color to the fabric. I started with the butterflies using acrylic paint and water to sort of thin and spread the paint. You could utilize fabric paint for this. Silk paint is also an option. I don't use anything special because the fabric isn't being worn. There's no need to soften the acrylic paint. There's also mediums you can add to acrylic paint that make it used for wearable fabrics. I'm not really concerned about that here because it's going to be on a canvas. It's okay if the paint gets a little bit stiff. The thing you need to remember with fabric when you're painting on it is that it is going to be very thirsty. It will absorb a lot of the paint. The water helps spread it, but you may have to come back in and put a few more layers over the top to make sure you get a vibrant color. You do have some control with the acrylic paint as far as how far it's going to spread. Sometimes with the water, depending on how much you wet it, it will bleed a little bit more. So you just have to keep that in mind as you work. Another thing to keep in mind is that in that first layer, it's not going to be very blendable. When you get into the second layer, you will have a little bit more ability to blend. But that first layer, part of it's going to get absorbed into the fabric, and your blending is a little more limited than it is on a canvas. It can be done, but you've got to think more about how you're layering the paint. All in all, I put about 2 layers of acrylic paint over this piece to get the color and vibrancy that I wanted. Here's just a quick shot of the piece after all of the painting has been completed and before I started embellishing. I wanted to use more of my custom fabric on this piece, and initially I thought her whole shirt would be one of my custom fabric designs. Instead, I opted to cut it apart and collage it as a necklace and create it more as an embellishment. I still felt like it wasn't finished, so I used glass beads, and I also freehand stitched around each piece of the necklace before beading it to give it more detail. I realized I had made a mistake in choosing this fabric for the flower petals because it blended in with the fabric of the shirt. I probably should have chosen 2 different colors. So in order to add contrast, I added this beading here, and that just kind of helps delineate it a little bit more from the shirt. So I'm at the stage where I am adding beads to the design. It does help to have this very thin, sharp beading needle to get through the cloth. It will bend a little bit, but that's okay. It just makes things go a lot faster with the beading. I chose Payne's Gray for the background of the canvas. I'm not still sure if that was the best choice, but I did like the stormy color that it offered. I started off applying it as a wash and using a brush and sort of adding it and then taking it away with a rag. By the end, and I'm not sure if I recorded that anywhere, I was using my fingers and hands to apply the paint and give it sort of a very stormy, kind of chaotic look. I'm now at the point where I'm going to cut her out. I need to start assembling the parts onto the canvas itself, and I'll be adding these into here. I'm going to have to cut her hand. It should be okay because the stitch should hold it together. And then I'm going to use stitching and glue to adhere her to the canvas. This will then go here with the hand kind of holding it over the top and just kind of layered in. I did want to point out a couple of things before I start cutting them. So the entire shirt is made with acrylic, as is the stem of the flower. The face and the hair, those are made with watercolor. I used these Neocolor water-soluble crayons. Which side they're opening on? Here we go. I just used these because they give me more precision and they blended in. Some of the color is from the graphite because it was water-soluble graphite when I did the blocked out sketch. But what you'll notice is that in some cases, the water or there was more bleed than others. So when you use the acrylic paint, there's going to be less bleed. Not completely prevented, but less. You'll notice there's a little bit of bleed here. These were areas where I had used or dipped my brush in water and used that to spread the paint around. With the acrylic, you're going to probably need several layers to get a nice bright color. The material is very thirsty, and the first layers will be very dull. So this is multiple layers of acrylic coming up there, and I've used a neon color to give it more bright pop. Otherwise, you're going to get a very dull color. The acrylic will act as sort of a wall or a dam, and it will reduce the amount of bleed. It won't completely prevent it, but you'll notice the bleed is a little bit more minimal. In some areas, it's non-existent at all. So it does give you a little more control than the watercolor. The watercolor itself is just going to do what it's going to do. It's going to travel throughout the material. So I allowed the watercolor here to dictate some of the value, or I should say, yeah, the value to the face. Left some areas white, but it's not completely white. You can see where it kind of just traveled in there. I can come back in with the watercolor crayon after it's dry and add some additional pops of color, which I did in the hair. But you can see that there was a lot more bleed here than there was with the acrylic. I'm not overly worried about this. If this were one solid piece or canvas, it may affect the materials that I used. I might have used acrylic here, or I might have used, there are some wax mediums that you can use to prevent water from traveling, or I should say paint from traveling. I've used those with silk painting. You could have also used silk paint on the cotton, and those are very bright, very pigmented, but they do bleed a lot. So you do have to, if you're concerned about bleed in your design, you're going to have to put something to prevent the bleed from happening. Okay, I lost my train of thought for just a minute. So I'm not concerned about bleed on this because I am going to cut her out and then stitch her down onto a canvas. The reason I did not work directly on the canvas is because it's easier to fold and manipulate the cloth here than it is on the canvas itself. So layering with the fabric, using it in mostly like a collage style and piecing it onto the canvas is much easier on yourself, both for technique and on your physical self. I have a canvas I'm working on right now, and because I am stitching directly on the canvas, it's a larger canvas, and the larger you get, the more you're going to have to bend in odd ways with your body, and it can be very challenging after a while to work in very odd positions. So anyway, my next steps in just a moment, I've got to go grab my fabric scissors and I've got to cut her out, and I'm going to start putting her down onto the larger canvas piece. I started off by snipping a little slit around the hand, which will allow me to push the crystal and the butterfly underneath and layer that over the top of her. And you can see I'm just going to kind of working it and seeing how it fits in there. So right now I'm fussy cutting her out, and then I'm going to stitch in the layers here with the butterfly. When you're doing this, you want to work slowly. You want to rotate the piece around as needed. You also can cut tiny slits. So like here in this detail area, I'll cut here, I'll rotate, I'll cut a little bit to here, and then I'll just kind of cut these smaller areas in that are easier as I rotate to cut it away. You want to try to be careful not to get too close to the stitch, but if you do make a mistake, like over here I made a mistake, I can just restitch that area up before I put it on the canvas. Just work slowly, and don't be too worried about going right up to the edge. It's fabric. It's supposed to be a little frayed. This is very loose. You're not looking for precise. If there's an area that bothers you a lot, like right here, I'll just gently trim it away. Again, try not to get too close. You can always come back and add a little paint to the edges if you want to, if you're really bothered, but I kind of like the look, so I just leave it that way. So let's get to cutting the rest of her out. I did want to pause right here to mention that if you need to, you can cut, not just cut, you can fold the material as you need to make it easier for you to cut. That's also the advantage of doing this at this stage before worrying about adding it to the canvas. And you may want to cut away larger sections just to make it easier for you to get in there. I do have a very sharp pair of fabric scissors here. I would prefer having there's some smaller scissors for sewing and embroidery where it's easier to get in there and they're kind of at an angle. I'd like to get some of those, but you want smaller scissors if you've got them. Otherwise, just use what you have. So let me finish cutting her out. So this is going to be the basic layout for the canvas. This will leave a little bit of white space here. The next part has to be done by hand. I'm going to use a little bit of matte medium to kind of glue her down, and I'll put in some strategic anchoring stitches with black thread. You'll notice that I left a little bit here. This is going to wrap around the bottom bar of the canvas, and I'll be able to staple it down to keep her in place. And here is the completed piece. I'll see you in another video in which I will tell you a little bit more about the story behind this piece. Thank you for watching.